Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
It is Thursday. We're glad you're here on the Three Martini Lunch. Grab your stool. We've got really bad news with a pretty good aftertaste, but yet to be seen is probably the best way to describe the aftertaste. We also have two distinctly crazy martinis, one which might be necessary and one which is just flat out disgusting. So if that doesn't whet your appetite at lunchtime, I don't know what else does. Jim, let's get right to our horrible martini, because this is not a repeat. This is not week-old news. It's just the same number, unfortunately. 6.6 million jobs lost in the last week. Same as last week, which followed 3.3 million jobs lost 2 weeks ago, for roughly 16 million jobs, or a little more than 10% of the workforce. And Jim, we've got 3 more Thursdays left before the end of this month. It's going to be real ugly when we get to decision time on what to do after April.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that jumps out here is we are used to having recessions, and we had the Great Recession, that were very bad, but they also moved at a pace that seems glacial compared to the number of layoffs and shut down businesses and the economic consequences of the coronavirus shutdown now. We always felt fine that you could measure unemployment's growth from month to month. And obviously, the next 2 months, you would generally see some subsequent revisions of that. And generally, you didn't see any dramatic revisions. Generally, that first number was pretty close to the ballpark. But now I think it's pretty clear that we are in uncharted territory here, where it changes dramatically week to week. I have no idea what's going to happen on that first Friday in May, but it's going to be a horrible number. It's going to be a number probably worse than the height of the Great Recession, which was around 10% and change. I think I've heard a lot of people throw around the number 14% is probably where we are right now. And between now and the end of the month, we could be considerably higher. So it's one of those things where we're seeing amongst policymakers, amongst health policy officials, this ongoing debate about, okay, how long do we have to keep the whole country on quarantine? I mentioned a number in the Morning Jolt today, just to give you sheer perspective of it. Roughly 80-some% of the counties in the United States are currently in some form of lockdown or shutdown or shelter in place or self-quarantining or rules like that. Obviously, and of those counties, they make up roughly 96% of the economic output of the United States. Yeah, there are probably some that are, if you're living in one of those counties that doesn't have those restrictions, terrific. I hope you're enjoying it and doing well. But, the places where we do most of our economic output are currently under this. That is the scale of this. And obviously, we can't function as a country with 96% of our economic production shut down. So the question is, okay, how much longer can we withstand this? I think numbers like this are pushing in the direction of, okay, we're going to have to accept a certain amount of risk of further infections and maybe not bending the curve as steeply downward as we would like to, simply because we have to get the economy going again. You and I talked earlier about various doctors saying, oh, you got to go 2 years. Look, I think you got till the end of May, and then I think people's patience will run out. And I think numbers like this add to the argument of our ability to fight this virus in part depends upon having the financial resources to devote to it. Shutting down our economy, like we voluntarily put our economy into a coma. And at some point, you got to wake the patient up out of the coma. Otherwise, the patient does not recover.
Jim, I don't know if it's fair to assume that the job losses for the rest of the month are going to continue at this pace at 6.6 million a week. You have to assume probably that most of these are from restaurants and leisure and resorts and that sorts of thing. And maybe it'll taper off over the next few weeks, but the numbers are still going to be really ugly. You said towards the end of May is going to be a decision time, perhaps. I think even before that, depending on the condition in certain areas, right at the end of April, there's going to be a huge debate. And there's going to be a lot of pressure. I think you're going to possibly see some severe disagreements between the likes of the president and his medical experts who, to this point, have largely stayed on the same page, at least publicly. I'm not sure that's going to stay the same if these numbers keep continuing for the next 3 weeks.
When I say May, I mean early May, not late May.
Okay, gotcha.
May Day.
Gotcha.
We people will be saying May Day on May Day.
Well, then all the socialists who usually party on May Day will see how horrible it actually works when you shut down a capitalist society. So maybe that'll be a silver lining here. But the actual silver lining that we have today on this is from the Fed. I know you're chewing really hard that the good news is from the Fed, but they actually jumped in today, which was kind of nice, given that the markets would have probably tanked on today's jobs news, but they're actually up a couple of percent because the Fed announced today a bevy of new moves, according to NBC, aimed at getting another $2.3 trillion of financing into businesses and revenue-pinched governments. Also, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell saying that he believes once we actually are through the coronavirus crisis, and then that's the big caveat here, he says the bounce back can be robust when it does come. So obviously when that is critical, but the idea that we can still maybe not have a V-shaped recession here, Jim, but at least have a pretty short bottom on the U-shaped recession is encouraging. Let's just hope it's sooner rather than later.
Yeah, if that U shape gets, curved up, we want to bend that a different curve in an upward direction on that one. Look, from the beginning of this, one of the things that is really, really weird about this sudden economic downturn is that, one, we were, in really good shape heading into it. We have not had a housing bubble burst. We have not had banks making wild, reckless loans that have crashed and then have taken them down with it. We have not had an oil shock, all the traditional reasons where you look at and say, oh, why did the United States have an economic downturn or a recession? They're not in play here. What is in play here is that people are reasonably concerned about catching coronavirus. This is a virus we don't have any natural immunity to. And social activity that involves work is going to necessarily expose people to this. I think my understanding is that there are a couple of meat packing plants where they've had to shut things down because workers have gotten sick, and you don't want sick workers handling meat. Maybe I'm foreshadowing one of our future martinis today. We're, on the one hand, when we say, look, we got to reopen the economy, I think everyone agrees with the general sentiment. The question is, how do you do it? What's the timing right? How much can you do social distancing in a workplace? Can you space people out on an assembly line, or is it simply because of the way the assembly line is constructed, people need to be within 6 feet of each other? Will masks work? All kinds of other factors that get into this idea of how do you do that? And then the next question will be, once we lift these things, how many people who at the beginning of this crisis had disposable income that they could have spent on a restaurant or traveling someplace, going to Disney World, staying in a hotel, taking a flight somewhere, going on a cruise, all of these industries that have just been slammed and effectively shut down. Will there be people who have that discretionary income to spend on these things? And that's an open question. I do kind of wonder at some point, and the other thing is, like, as much as we want people to go out and spend money, when people go through a traumatic, one of the things that made the Great Recession so difficult was that when it came on, hit really hard 2008 and early 2009, people were understandably reluctant to spend money, even if they had it, because they didn't know what the future was going to hold. They didn't know if their jobs were secure. They didn't know if their business they worked at was still going to be there 6 months from now or a year from now. And so people spent less money. That's a vicious cycle that worsens things. So if we can get people to increase their spending, it'll be terrific. But unfortunately, it's going to be it all depends on how much people can spend and how much they feel comfortable spending after having this giant, completely unforeseeable economic curveball thrown their way.
Not getting a lot of help from Congress. The Senate today not getting it done on a Republican proposal to add $250 billion to the small business coronavirus relief. There was $350 billion in the bill that passed several days ago. They're quickly finding out that's not going to be enough. And so Mitch McConnell wanted another $250 billion. The Democrats wanted more than that. And since there's only a couple people on the floor, there was no unanimous consent. So they're off till Monday. So good luck, everyone. Let's go to our first crazy martini now here, Jim, and let's talk about Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci, of course, has become a ubiquitous figure in media and at the briefings and everything. And he was asked an interesting question by the Wall Street Journal podcast. What's going to change forever? Not just for a few weeks or a few months here, but what's going to change forever because of this? And here's what he said.
And just as a society, just forget about shaking hands. We don't need to shake hands. We've got to break that custom, because as a matter of fact, that is really one of the major ways that you can transmit a respiratory-borne illness.
So, Jim, I think it's going to be really awkward, given the instincts that we've built up in ourselves over years and years and years, not to shake hands with people. That's always generally considered rude, but I think at least during cold and flu season, and if we know there's an outbreak, I think people are going to be better about it, but that's going to take some getting used to.
Yeah, the interesting thing, have we seen the end of the era of the handshake? One of the things that early on, both I noticed and lots of other people on social media were observing that, after at first people it was so out of character to not shake people's hands. Right before, the rules really got stringent, we were hearing about this stuff, but people weren't really, sure how seriously to take it. I went to a wedding. And everyone, I was already at the elbow bumping stage of things. A couple of people wanted to shake hands, and I was like, "Hey, how about we elbow bump?" And they're like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yes, really." By the way, everyone's turned out fine. No cases at the wedding. Everybody seemed to be okay. But it's one of those things where people started noticing, like when they started seeing people touching each other, whether it's handshakes, hugs, all these other, or not social distancing while watching TV shows and movies. Like it felt weird. It's like, "Well, no, don't do that." Step away. No, you don't want to touch them like that, So I think it's an interesting question of how quickly we adopted this idea of recognizing shaking a hand could end up being something that inadvertently spreads germs and could have serious health consequences for this. It's always been an argument that all in all, handshakes were not necessarily hygienic. This is, maybe we'll all adopt Japanese bowing. Maybe we'll all do some sort of yoga-like namaste and, put our hands together and bow or make some sort of gesture or something like that. I think you're right. I think it will be a while before people feel comfortable physically touching each other in ways that are, obviously not sexual, obviously, but respectfully affectionate. Early on, I saw a joke that was, it defined the time where, in 2018, 2019, when a boss had a hand on a female employee's shoulder, it's like, "Oh my God, that's sexual harassment. Stop that. It's me too." Now it's like, "Get your grubby hands off of me. I don't know if you have coronavirus."
So, Jim, you mentioned the bowing in Asian cultures and perhaps the namaste yoga look. I feel like those for America are a little too formal. So what would be more appropriate for America? Do you do like the finger guns like Isaac the bartender on Love Boat? Do you go the casual wave? Fist bump, but that's still running a little bit of a risk there. So what would be a good American alternative to the handshake that doesn't necessarily copy another culture and is kind of more representative of how we roll?
Greg, I'm suddenly realizing, you realize touchdown celebrations will never be the same. Or at least won't be for a while. High five? No, everybody's going to leave you hanging. Anybody? No. You know what? There's going to be some sort of like mimed gesture. There's going to be some sort of like, symbolic gesture that mimics it. But maybe it'll be more, actually, it will be mime. It'll be some sort of like general action. How like sometimes they do the things where somebody jumps up and down and everyone else acts like they're being bounced or something. People will figure out all kinds of different gestures that do not involve physical touching. They'll communicate the affection. They will communicate the camaraderie, all that kind of stuff. But I think, the end of handshakes and probably the end of high fives and such are, disappearing as well.
Yeah. When I first started dating my wife and we got together with a group of friends, it took forever to give everybody a handshake and so forth. So you just kind of walk in the room and give an air high five and then everybody air high fives back. I realized that if people aren't familiar with it, it could look like you're a bunch of Nazis. So that's a little bit risky. But in general, if you want to stay germ-free, that's one way to do it. But I think everybody's going to have their own little tweak on this. So it could be fun to watch. And given the way social media responds, I'm guessing some of these ideas are going to come along pretty fast. All right, let's move on to our second crazy martini. And I warned you at the start, folks. It is lunchtime. If you're eating right now, you might want to stop eating or hit pause, but do come back to it later. But let's talk about one of the reasons that things don't go well with China when it comes to viruses and other things. We've talked about the bats, we've talked about the labs, but now there's this. Jim, this is in your morning jolt today, and this is from the Washington Post. China's food safety problems have no better symbol than the illegal and utterly disgusting problem of gutter oil. Cooking oil is used heavily in Chinese food, so some street vendors and hole-in-the-wall restaurants buy cheap black market oil that's been recycled from garbage. You read that correctly. Enterprising men and women will go through dumpsters, trash bins, gutters, and even sewers, scooping out liquid or solid refuse that contains used oil or animal parts. Then they process that into cooking oil, which they sell at below market rates to food vendors who use it to cook food that can make you extremely sick. No kidding. Jim, I don't know exactly when I'm going to eat lunch today, but it's certainly not going to be soon.
I just would observe, look, people know that I traditionally write about politics and campaigns and elections, and that since this began, I don't think of myself as a health reporter. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV, but this has been the biggest and most interesting story in the world, the most consequential story in the world. And so each morning I'm getting up and trying to learn more about the possible chain that led this virus to end up in humanity, a trail that leads back to China. And, a couple of times I have laid out the evidence that points to either the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan Center for Disease Control, both of which were doing research on coronaviruses in bats. But I am quick to emphasize the evidence is coincidental. There is no smoking gun. There is no clear memo saying, "Oh, oopsie, the bat bit you," and then Louis went to the market that day or something like that. We don't have anything quite like that. Somebody sent forward to this to me, a reader named David. Thank you, David. I had eaten before I'd read it, and then I wish I had not. And this was, this has been covered several times throughout the years. This is not something that just started in China. Although if you're wondering, yes, it was continuing. There were articles you could still find about it in December 2019. And so, cooking oil is at a premium in China. Everybody are always looking for a way to figure out a way to get it cheaper. And so basically they are looking for globs of fat in the sewers, in any conceivable place where you're going to find built up globs of all the grease that ends up clogging your sinks and drains and all that stuff. They're like, hey, we can reuse that. Now you might be like, to begin with. David had said, how do we know where the sewer lines from these two labs go? And how do we know that all of the stuff that they're dealing with these coronaviruses and bats is being properly disposed of? Could this be a possible vector to get the virus into human beings? And on the one hand, yes, it could. On the other hand, this just kind of indicates, well, if this kind of stuff is going on, the possibility of this getting through some sort of consumed pangolin at the wet market is that's another strong possibility. I think my biggest thought, though, Greg, when I saw this was, dear God, how do the Chinese not have mass debilitating food poisoning on a regular basis? And if you're saying, okay, this must just be one or two places. Look, for what it's worth, there was one study by one Chinese food safety scientist who calculated he believed 1 out of every 10 meals in China was using what they called this gutter oil. I would say let that sink in, but I don't think I'd even want to use that metaphor. Just use, so let's assume he's wildly overstating it, and it's not 1 in 10. It's 1 in 20. It's still way more people who are having their food cooked in oil that has been in some sort of extraordinarily unsanitary situation. Does this tell us where the coronavirus and SARS-CoV-2 is from? No, I don't know. It's an interesting piece of the puzzle. I think it does indicate this. And I think it is further indication, if this really did come from a wet market, and that is a line from the Chinese government, and it is worth noting that virologists have been saying since long before this, hey, this is exactly the kind of circumstance where a virus could jump from one species to another. But they're still open. The Huanan seafood market in Wuhan is closed, but the other wet markets in China are open. And so this entire process, if this is indeed how it jumped to a human, this could be happening with some other virus today, tomorrow, or at any point in the future. Something that I think is, just in case you were feeling too reassured, heading like you're really disgusted, and then I left you really frightened. So, boy, happy Easter weekend, everybody.
It's absolutely disgusting to listen to all of that, but I have to say it makes me feel better about invoking the 5-second rule compared to what's going on in China. I think the 5-second rule, depending on what actually got dropped, of course, is reasonable. Although perhaps that will be one of the things that also goes
depends
away.
on where you dropped it, right? Kitchen floor. Did you clean it recently? Okay, maybe you're very right.
Yes, exactly. Hey, who's going to love the new non-handshake policies? In addition to Howie Mandel, of course, wasn't President Trump reported to be a germaphobe freak and didn't like to shake hands? Obviously, he does it now, but back in the day, he hated that, right?
Early on, I had said this semi-tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. One of the reasons I had doubted that Trump would ever actually run for president, instead of flirting with the idea every 4 years as it seemed to do, is that, running for president, you have to shake hands. You have to physically interact with people, and Trump did not like that. But obviously he overcame it, and, maybe he was right the first time, and maybe all of us should have avoided those handshakes. Maybe we all just waved. You know what? Vulcans. If you do it with your hand, that's the thing, just go up to everybody, live long and prosper. And everybody feels good. And I find that line of thinking, Greg, logical.
Trump at some briefing in the next 2 weeks. I told you, I was right about this years ago.
There you go.
No handshaking. This could have all been avoided. I was right. Yeah. Anyway, Jim, there is a 3 Martini Lunch podcast tomorrow. However, you have the day off, so have a blessed Easter with your family, and we will see you again on Monday.
Yes. Look, it's not like I'm going anywhere, but yes, everyone over there hopefully has a happy Easter weekend.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos, Radio America. Thank you so much for being with us today. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a kind review with 5 stars, and also remember that you can get us on those home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. And join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.